Hi, this is Debbie, and today I'm sharing a card looking at a way you can use the stencil with watercolour that I created for my Doodling with Debbie series for Simon Says Stamp. My love of watercolouring is still running strong, and my mind often turns to how I can use this wonderful media with my supplies. I love the design of the Bouquet of Roses stencil, and I knew it would look stunning ink blended, but my paints were calling, and so I set about combining the two. Before I used the stencil though, I decided to create a soft warm background to the piece on which I could add the stencil design. I took a piece of cold pressed watercolour card and taped it to a board to help prevent warping. I started by using a flat brush to wash the card with plain clear water and then brought in a dilute wash of warm colours. The paints I'm using are from Daniel Smith, and this was a colour I already had on my palette, which I previously mixed from a base of quinacridone gold and adding in some quinacridone coral for a richer, warm colour. I'm keeping the mixture quite dilute though, because ultimately this will be a background and I don't want it to compete with the stencil design I'll be painting on top. There are a number of advantages to creating a background wash such as this. Firstly, it means that you have colour in the background of a design and you don't need to go in after working with a stencil and paint around all the areas afterwards. Secondly, with watercolours being translucent, this warm wash will add the effect that every colour painted on top of it is getting a warm, wonderful glow. I don't know if you've heard of the term golden hour in relation to the warm light just before dawn and just after dawn and just before sunset, which photographers love. Well, a wash such as this is like adding golden hour to a painting. Off screen, I sprayed the back of the Bouquet of Roses stencil with a repositional adhesive which will keep the stencil in place. This spray has been life-changing for me when using stencils. No more worrying about stencils shifting halfway through what I was doing. I tested various ways of using a stencil with watercolours, and my favoured method for a relatively simple design such as this stencil was to lightly draw the design in with a pencil. I did try painting directly through the stencil with watercolours, and this can work. However, I like to use cold pressed watercolour card, and the texture of card means that even with the spray adhesive on the back of the stencil, it isn't totally reliable and you can get paint seeping under the stencil and ruining the design. If you wanted to try this method, I would recommend using a smoother hot press watercolour card instead. Another method you could use is to ink blend through the stencil with a light water reactive ink such as Antique Linen Distress ink. This would lay down the design of the stencil and then you could paint over the top, and the water reactive ink would combine with the watercolour as you painted. However, with a warm yellow wash already down, I didn't want to add ink with a similar tone and for it to dominate the colour scheme. So that's how I planned for this method, lightly drawing the design in with a pencil, erasing the pencil lines until they were only just visible, and then using these as a guide to paint on top. You want to make sure the pencil lines are as light as possible because the watercolours will trap the pencil underneath and you won't be able to erase the lines after the fact. With the stencil design penciled in, it's now just a case of filling in the shapes. My aim with each shape was to get lots of lovely variation in colour and ensuring there were areas of deeper shadow and lighter highlight areas too. I painted each shape and then dotted deeper colours into the areas I thought there would be shadows, such as the base of a leaf, letting the wet paints blend together. As I painted, I used more dilute paint in areas to create lighter highlight areas, but sometimes these were lost when all the paints blended together, and so to retain areas of highlight, I used a brush which was just damped with clean water to lift some of the paint away. For the leaves, I mainly used sap green with a little undersea green and then added quinacridone coral for colour variation. You have to be careful in adding green and red together because being complementary colours, if they mix too much you'll just get a muddy brown. If you start to see this happen, then lift the colour with a damp brush and try again. With the leaves painted, I moved on to the flowers and I'm continuing the warm colour scheme I started with the background layer, and in fact mainly using the same colours too, but this time I'm using a stronger concentration of the pink quinacridone rose to the yellow quinacridone gold to give a warm peachy orange colour. In the same way as the leaves, I'm aiming for shadows and highlights and variation in colour too, by adding more yellow to one side of the petal and more coral to the other. I moved around the stencil, completing the first layer of colour over all the areas and keeping a paper towel in hand to mop up mistakes and remove excess water when I wanted a damp brush for lifting colour to retain highlights. With the base layer down, I then moved on to adding deeper colours and building up that texture that adding layers adds. When doing this, I added a second brush. This is just damped with clean water and I use it to soften the edges of the new deeper layers. With 2 brushes on the go, it saves paint as I can keep using the first brush to add colour and the second to soften the edges while they're still wet and workable, without having to rinse precious paint off my first brush to do the same. I use dilute versions of the colours on my palette to give the impression of more petals and leaves. Using a dilute paint will mean these dry lighter in colour and will give the impression of being in the background, and the contrast between the lighter and darker colours adds that contrast and interest. And so not only have you got the lighter and darker colours on each petal and leaf, but lighter petals and leaves too, and the combination creates a more interesting overall design. Basically, I keep fussing with this, adding paint, mopping it up with a paper towel, adding darker areas, softening them with a damp brush, and I will always say that watercolours look messy up until the point that suddenly you start to like where it's going. Once I was happy with where I was at, I added dilute splatter in the colours I'd used, aiming to keep the green splatter mainly over the leaves and the yellows and corals over the flowers. I have been asked why I like to add splatter so much, and I think it's because for me it adds that extra layer while also softening the lines and giving more of a loose look, which I love. One other thing I love to do, and that is to use coloured pencils to add more depth and a few details. The key here is to make sure your pencils are sharp and you use a light hand. There's nothing against going back in with watercolours after using pencils too to add more depth. Finally, I added a splatter with white gouache and then my favourite Perfect Pearl solution for sparkle. The white did feel a bit stark against the warm colours of this piece, and so I splattered with iridescent gold too. And this card certainly turned out to be very splattery. Is that a real word? But it fits this piece perfectly. I removed the blue painter's tape, and in doing so you get a much better impression of the colours you've used. The blue tape works so well for keeping the card down, but it does rather jar with the colour scheme, and when it's finally removed you can see the true colours and appreciate all that sparkle and splatter too. I die cut the panel with a wonky rectangle die using washi tape to keep it in place while I ran it through my die cutting machine, and then I wrapped May Arts twine around the panel several times. I love this twine for adding that rustic feel to a card, and once I tied it in a bow I was ready then to add the sentiment. I picked a greeting from the Tiny Words Encouragement set and stamped it in clear embossing ink on slate card, which I treated with an anti-static powder bag. The powder from this bag will help to prevent the embossing powder I sprinkle on top randomly sticking everywhere. I sprinkled with white embossing powder from Simon Says Stamp and then heat set before trimming to a banner. When deciding where to place the sentiment piece, I wanted to move the bow around, and it's easy to do this by bending the watercolour panel slightly, and that loosens the twine, enabling it to be shifted around to where I wanted it. I added foam adhesive to the back of the greeting and placed it on the background using a T-square ruler to make sure I had it on straight before one final wiggle of the twine until I was happy. Then by adding foam adhesive to the back of the panel, this will keep the twine in place and stop it moving around anymore. I then added the watercolour piece to a card base cut and scored from a £100 Desert Storm card, which continues the warm rustic feel of this card. I arranged a few Your Peachy sequins and then added Nuvo dragon scale droplets, which I love the iridescent sheen of. Finally, I kept the sequins in place with Gina K Connect glue. And that completes this watercolour card using the Bouquet of Roses stencil. I'll leave links in the YouTube description below to the products that I've used today, as well as a link to the coordinating blog post over at limedoodledesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you've enjoyed this tutorial, I'd be delighted if you subscribe to this channel. Also, if you'd like to get notified when a new video is out, don't forget to hit the bell button next to the subscribe button too. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.